Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to the Globe and Mail's Sustainable Finance Summit. I'm Jeff Jones, ESG and Sustainable Finance reporter for the Globe and Mail, and I'll be moderating some of today's discussions along with my colleagues, Ryan McDonald and Sierra Bain. Today, we'll be talking about new and pressing developments in sustainable finance. Domestic and global investors are increasingly attracted to cleaner businesses, technologies, and industries. But at the same time, the field has experienced no shortage of controversy and upheaval since we last met a year ago. There's been backlash, delays, but new funding, and all against the backdrop of increasing weather-related damage here and around the world. There are new and upcoming regulations businesses should be mindful of, at least that's what we keep being told, and changes to ESG reporting and disclosure requirements. And, I might add, a necessity to bolster competitiveness. We have a stellar group of speakers today to make sense of it all for us. So let's introduce our first guest. Joining me today is Sandra Odendahl, Senior Vice President and Head of Sustainability, Diversity, and Social Impact with BDC. Sandra also serves on the Canadian Sustainability Standards Board. Also joining us is Dr. Ryan Reardon, Director of Research with the Institute of Sustainable Finance at Queen's University Smith School of Business. And of course, the Institute brings together academia, the private sector, and government to help shape Canada's sustainable finance ecosystem. Both of these folks have been in the trenches for many of the key developments in sustainable finance in this country, so I'm very excited to put them on the hot seat. Ryan, as mentioned, it's been a tumultuous 12 months in sustainable finance and ESG in Canada. What do you see as the most important positive and negative developments?
Well, as a positive guy, I'm going to try to focus on the positives. But first of all, thank you very much for having me. Thank you for the introduction. It's been a really busy and I would also say an exciting time for sustainable finance in the last 6 to 12 months, and I think in the next in the coming 6 to 12 months. Some of the highlights that I would like to point out would be last fall's economic statement. This is where the federal government finally, or I wouldn't say finally, but perhaps for some people they would say finally, their support for mandatory corporate sustainable finance disclosures. And really what that means is that we at some point are going to get a taxonomy. And for those that, I'm sure everyone out there that's listening is already initiated, but for those that are uninitiated, this really just means that we're looking forward to a commonly agreed set of criteria for investments in things like emissions reductions. And the importance about that is that investors then have confidence that that what they're investing in really does have the intended effect of reducing emissions or having some sort of positive impact. And I think that's important for us to unlock climate capital. I know we're going to talk about that in a couple of minutes as well. And sort of the bugaboo, cutting corporate greenwashing. I think it's a little bit overblown, but I think it is a nice step towards reducing greenwashing and particularly to reducing concerns about greenwashing. And a lot of jurisdictions have already implemented taxonomies or in the process of doing so. And I think we really need to get moving on that. Two other things I'd like to highlight. We've seen some draft sustainability reporting standards from the Canadian Sustainability Standards Board. And really what I'd hope to see is at some point that these draft standards lead to the Canadian Securities Administrator reviving their proposed disclosure rules for Canadian companies. As we know, the EU and the SEC in the US have some draft proposals out there and some that are a little bit further along. So it'd be nice if Canada had those as well. And I think that's something that we could see in the future. Finally, something that's really dear to my heart, and I think something that we're really pushing at the ISF is our nature-related financial disclosures. So some of us know TCFD, but the TNFD, I think, is going to be the next big thing in sustainable finance. Our economy, the Canadian one, depends on nature in myriad ways. I mean, it's really, it's sort of hard to not look out the window. I happen to not be in Canada right now, but not look out the window and see nature and see how it impacts us individually in our firms. And so much of this value, it just hasn't been accounted for. And I think that's really something that we're going to see in the future.
Well, you talked about the taxonomy. Ryan, and I'm wondering about where that effort sits, because as we know, the group in charge of it, the Sustainable Finance Action Council, has finished its mandate. I think they were a little bit disappointed that they weren't allowed to, or weren't able to move that initiative along further. What's the next step in your view?
Um, I think there are lots of next steps. As you mentioned, the SFAC finished its mandate, completed its mandate, and sort of wrapped up. They've done great work. So this under the leadership of Kathy Bardswick and Barb Svan. And let's just maybe highlight for some of the people that don't know about SFAC, but 25 of Canada's largest financial institutions came together, developed a consensus, and made some recommendations to the federal government that were actually quite good. And so what I think is next is that there's a lot of work to do on the individual streams from SFAC. And that means that we're going to be working on advancing sustainability disclosure. So with the taxonomy, improving the quality and availability of our data. And I would just say, I mean, I don't want to say stay tuned. It sounds kind of trite, but I'd say stay tuned. I think there's a lot more to come from SFAC, and particularly on the individual work streams. And hopefully the federal government will put into place the recommendations soon, maybe directly after this summit.
Well, Sandra, let's get you into this conversation. I mean, what are your thoughts on the momentum of sustainable finance in this country? I mean, we're not in a vacuum here, and other countries, I should say, are moving quickly in, for instance, making climate-related disclosure mandatory.
Yeah. So I think that there is quite a lot of momentum still in sustainable finance in Canada and around the world. And so, looking at sustainable finance from a number of different perspectives, I would say there's three areas where I see momentum and where we at BDC see momentum. So I'm going to talk about lending, investing, and reporting, which Ryan talked about a little bit already. So I would say on the lending side, we are seeing clients borrowing, and as you may know, and I don't know if the audience knows, but BDC is a sort of federal crown corp, and we finance entrepreneurs. So we are here to support us Canadian small and medium-sized businesses. So that's our focus. So on the lending side, we are seeing clients borrowing to increasingly borrowing to acquire certified green buildings, to get advice and financing for commercial green retrofits. We recently financed a low carbon fuel facility expansion. So on the ground in the real world, we are seeing financing for sustainable purposes for business continues to tick upward, which is fantastic. And also on the sustainability side, that is the social side, we all are also seeing that we have a growing portfolio of loans supporting Indigenous and Black entrepreneurs, through a number of partnerships and some of our own direct lending. So plenty going on that front. On the investment side as well, still a fair amount of momentum over the last couple of years. Not sure if you know, but we're one of Canada's largest clean tech investors. We have $1 billion committed between our clean tech and our climate tech venture cap funds. So every dollar that we commit to clean tech fund, when we did an analysis of this just over a year ago, found that it has helped attract an additional $6 in additional private sector funding. So that's another indication of momentum. And in fact, just about a year ago, we launched a new $150 million sustainability venture fund. So that is another, indicator, another sign. Like that fund was launched because there are opportunities broadly in investing in venture cap with a sustainability tilt. And again, I want to not just talk about environment. So I'm going to just mention another thing, another sign of momentum is, investing in we put $100 million into something called Thrive Lab. So investing in women-led social impact businesses at the very early stages of development, partnering with organizations to bring capital, but also resources and expertise to help grow and nurture these companies. So lending, investing, lots going on. And then on the reporting side, absolutely, there's a ton of momentum around reporting. In fact, it's hard to keep up with all the acronyms globally, that's for sure. But two pieces that I'm particularly excited about, of course, was the ISSB, the International Sustainability Standards Board, last June, coming out with their rules around sustainability reporting broadly, as well as climate-related reporting, so known as S1 and S2. And then the Canadian Sustainability Standards Board, on which I'm privileged to be a member, we just released the exposure draft for public comment in March. So the CSDS 1 and 2, which align to the ISSB 1 and 2 standards, are out for public comment. And rest assured, Ryan, you referred to this a little bit. Definitely, the CSSB, used IFRS S1 and S2 as a baseline to develop the proposed standards for Canada. The standards are not hugely different from what was proposed with IFRS. Some recommended changes in implementation timelines and ways of implementing to take account the fact that our economy is a bit different, and one of the big ways is it skews much more to small business than many other economies. So I think that's a big momentum piece, and it's not just the ISSB and CSSB, but in the US we're seeing a number of standards, and in Europe. I would argue it's a little bit of reporting standard soup right now, and I do see signs, though, and this is the hopeful part, that it's going to start to converge and clean up a little bit over time, because right now there's a lot.
Well, Ryan, on that front, I think you said that there has been so much consultation on this issue when it comes to reporting standards and moving them to requirements. We've had a few years of consultations when it came to an original plan by the CSA to get that ball rolling. We've got the one in place right now that Sandra mentioned, right? The CSSB one, and of course the CSA said, once that's finished, they will run another consultation. At what point have we consulted enough on this issue where we can actually start implementing the rules that seem to be coalescing?
Well, I could give you a one-word answer, which should be now, but I could maybe give you a little bit more. I think that I don't want to say the time for consultation is over. That would be, again, a little too trite. But I think we generally know what the regulations should look like. I think we know what should be voluntary. I think we know what should be mandatory. I think it's time for Canadian regulators to take a look around, particularly Europe, Australia, and the United States. Take a look at what probably works. We have recommendations from SVAC as to what's potentially going to work for Canada, and put those rules out for, we've already got the consultation, but really just for final comments, and start implementing. I think we're falling behind other jurisdictions. It's easy to be painted with the greenwashing brush if we don't have regulations in place that other jurisdictions do. And I think we're just, we're doing a disservice to our companies and to corporate Canada and to our investors by dragging our feet. So yes, a little bit more consultation just to sort of wrap it up, sort of to close the loops. But I think we need to do this relatively quickly.
Isn't the kind of the elephant in the room here, Sandra? You mentioned about the Canadian economy being unique. We know that small and medium-sized businesses dominate the economy, but at the same time, we're a very large resource producer. Some of the pushback has been on the idea, for instance, of having to report Scope 3 emissions, which is pretty difficult in that sector, and there's a fair amount of pushback to it. Is this a hump we can get over?
Yeah, so it's a really good question. When it comes to reporting, and I would say it's the do and the say. So the actions expected of small and medium-sized businesses, as well as the reporting. I think it's definitely challenging for small and medium-sized enterprises. And in fact, I would say this is true in other jurisdictions. Certainly, um, BDC, we talk to development banks in other jurisdictions that also work with small and medium-sized companies. For example, the British Business Bank, BPI France, and this is a challenge that the banks in Germany, where they also have a very robust small and medium-sized enterprise economy. Everybody's trying to figure out how do you right size this for small and medium-sized businesses that are in fact part of the supply chain, to the big companies that have made perhaps that have very robust and in some cases now regulated reporting requirements. So I think that, yeah, this is a big problem. So I actually, I'll talk about reporting, but I think I want to also make a point about the do in a second. So in terms of reporting, yeah, what we have seen is, of course, an increasing number of large companies are asking their suppliers, which sometimes are not very large companies, for ESG information because the large companies, investors, and in some cases regulators are asking them to report on it. And so last year we actually did a survey. So we surveyed 121 major buying organizations in the public and private sector on their intentions around ESG disclosure. And basically more than 82% said they were already asking for information on at least one ESG criteria. And in fact, it was only, they were expected to be well over 90% of them would be doing this by this year. And so on one hand, so for example, we see there's a role to be played by, certainly by BDC and by other organizations in helping inform and advise SMEs on, the advantage to having good ESG disclosure, whether it's formally regulated or not, but having a good story to tell, being able to report on it. This is your future. Your customers are going to be asking, so you can either lead or you're going to be dragged along. But on the other hand, we're also advocating for sanity in ESG and sustainability reporting demands. This is a real hardship for small and medium enterprises. And one thing that, I think is really important is that the information that's being asked of SMEs in the supply chain, or actually being asked of anybody, is a decision useful for the company or the organization making the request? Like, how are you going to use that information that somebody somewhere is going to have to figure out how to gather, report, possibly audit, standardize, et cetera? Is this a tick box exercise, or is this driving decisions about, how you choose your suppliers, how you are helping to execute on your own strategy? Reporting has to be right-sized and for the sake of all the data providers, but especially for the small ones who don't have teams of sustainability people and can't afford expensive consultants to help them. So in reporting, one of the things that we've been thinking about at BDC is the importance of actually not only asking for specific quantitative data, let's say on emissions numbers, which to some extent, some of this information is important, but we also think it's important that we don't lose the plot and that we are actually also tracking and interested in knowing how much actual activity and implementation changes that clients, and in our case, we survey clients and former clients on, have you taken any one of these, 1 to 6, any one of these environmental actions in the last year? And we find that that is also a really useful way to see if the needle is actually moving. So for example, have you switched your fleet to hybrid or electric vehicles? We would ask that versus tell us the exact emissions of your fleet when your trucks ran on gas versus now that they're electric charged. We actually don't necessarily want the number. We want to know that you did it because there's a lot of data to show that an electric vehicle emits less CO2 than an internal combustion engine. We don't actually need the exact number at this point. So I think there's a sanity request from the entire sustainability reporting ecosystem. And I know for small and medium-sized business, it's actually critical for them. And I suspect it's a very important point for larger companies who also have to make decisions about where to allocate scarce resources. And while data and reporting are really useful up to a point, we're not going to report our way out of a climate crisis. And I would rather see companies taking actions that are known to make a positive impact. If they have limited resources, that's more important than using all the resources on complicated measurement protocols that, may or may not drive decision making out there in the world. So that's the reporting side of this. I'll pause there.
Well, we've got probably just about 4 or 5 minutes left here, but I wanted to get into the topic that comes up whenever you get sustainability professionals together these days, and that's the pushback that we're seeing against ESG, specifically in the United States, especially when it comes to fossil fuel producing states with Republican leadership. I keep hearing that Canada is less susceptible to such moves, pardon me, but we've seen that Canadian companies, financial institutions, for example, can get ensnared in this quite easily. There's an open market with bilateral trade, so it's kind of tough to ignore this issue in this country because we're not, as I said before, we're not operating in a vacuum. So Ryan, where do you think that this might go? And I was going to say that, Canada's kind of getting pushed from the other side as well, from across the Atlantic Ocean to do more when it comes to sustainable finance. So what's the answer for Canadians?
Well, I think I don't think I can get it to a complete answer in 3 minutes, but I can give you my hot take on it. I think that ESG is doing a disservice to making real progress. I think that we're throwing too many topics that aren't clearly objectively good in together, and then assuming that everyone feels the same way about them. So what I'd like to do, we're at the Institute for Sustainable Finance, and we really think more about the E and part of the ESG. And I think we should really focus on individual things that I think we can all agree on and being positive. Reducing emissions, increasing biodiversity. There's all sorts of S&G topics. I won't talk about those, but I think really focusing on the individual components of these. There's a real clear scientific link between emissions, global warming, health and welfare outcomes, extreme weather. I don't think we really need, even in Republican states in the US, I don't think we really need to debate those things. And from the other perspective, I think the Europeans are also right. The Europeans are saying, hey, look, we've made a lot of progress on a lot of topics that are really important. Everyone in the world is suffering the consequences, and Canada needs now to move and do their part. We're flanked on two sides by the largest trading partners that have really good, robust, and almost completely implemented sort of climate regulation or E part of the ESG regulation. The last little thing is we can't forget, and maybe this is a little bit of a jab, but ESG was a creation of the financial industry, right? So people created this, put some numbers in there, and then sold it to individuals. And so to me, it's not really a big surprise that it wasn't completely well thought out. The ESG ratings across different ratings agencies differ. I think we should do ourselves a service in sustainable finance in Canada and really think about the components that we know are important and focus on those.
Sandra, what do you think? How do we depoliticize this?
Yeah, I agree up to a point with Ryan. I think ESG is political very much in the States because the term has been used to mean 1,000 different things and it's lost the plot. And in the States, it's become synonymous with, it depends who you are, but it's either synonymous with too much wokeness, whatever that is, or too much action to curb climate change. And as Ryan said, this was a creation of the financial industry, the UNFFI Finance Initiative 2004, but it was intended to really just make sure that people involved in making investment decisions didn't forget to incorporate the important material so-called non-financial issues in doing a comprehensive due diligence. So it was actually very well intended for its purpose, which was for investment and lending professionals to make sure that they were being thorough. It completely, I don't know, I sort of joke, the marketing people got a hold of it, and it just completely started to take on a million different meanings. I think the thing to know about ESG is that it's not about being woke, it's about thorough due diligence. But when you want to develop a strategy, a nod to the Institute for Sustainable Finance, it's actually about sustainability. It's about balancing environmental, social, and economic priorities, and really making sure that you're not forgetting to consider the whole picture when you're, when you're developing an economy or running a society.
Unfortunately, we have to leave it there. I mean, seems like we just got started and we've just scratched the surface of some pretty important issues. Thank you, Sandra and Ryan, for joining us today. That was a great discussion to open today's program. And now I'd like to hand things off to my colleague, Sierra Bain, to moderate the next topic.
I'm Sierra Bain. I'm a content editor here at the Globe and Mail. I'm also the author of our climate newsletter, so I'm very much looking forward to hosting this next discussion. One of the biggest steps for sustainable finance in Canada is the development of a green and transition taxonomy. It will help investors and financial institutions understand where capital should be located. We have a great group of people here to update us on what's happening with the taxonomy and what might be on the horizon. So let's introduce our panelists. First, we have Jonathan Arnold, Acting Director of Clean Growth with the Canadian Climate Institute. Next, we have Roger Beauchemin, President and CEO of Addenda Capital. And last but not least, we have Thait Sagir, Senior Vice President and Head of Sustainability with Mackenzie Investments. Welcome, everyone. Let's jump right in. So I'm going to start with you, Jonathan. For those in the audience who might not be as familiar with the Green and Transition Taxonomy, could you just please provide an update on what it is?
Yeah, sure, happy to. And even just to take it up a level higher than that, just in terms of what a taxonomy is. I mean, I think most people are familiar with the term from their high school biology class or something like that, where it's a way of categorizing in nature organisms. What we're trying to do here is categorize and standardize the activities in our economy to better understand what is actually aligned with our climate objectives. And so the idea of having a sustainable finance taxonomy, or what we call in Canada the Green and Transition Taxonomy, is really a way of standardizing the way we communicate about this. And the last conversation there with Sandra and Ryan got into this in terms of all of the different ways that different financial institutions and companies are measuring and thinking about ESG. That leads to a lot of confusion in capital markets. So really what taxonomies are trying to do is just to have a single approach on how we talk about these different activities in the economy, so that we know that, say, wind and solar, yes, that is aligned with 1.5 degrees. That helps reduce greenwashing. It helps mobilize private capital. So that's really what we're trying to do with this. Right now, so I was part of the group that was helping the Sustainable Finance Action Council develop the Green and Transition Taxonomy Roadmap Report, and that was submitted this time last year in 2023 to the federal government. We're still waiting to have the federal government endorse this taxonomy, put some dollars behind it, and really turn it into an independent structure that could provide kind of that overarching guidance to capital markets and as I say, help reduce greenwashing and also help mobilize private finance.
Thank you. And I'm going to stick with you for 1 second. The Canadian Climate Institute actually issued a report on this topic earlier this year. Could you maybe walk us through a couple of the takeaways?
Sure. Yeah. So the report that you're talking about or referring to, that was in January of this year, and it was looking at how the taxonomy could apply to the oil and gas sector. So this is arguably the most challenging sector to incorporate into a green and transition taxonomy. But I think it's helpful in the sense that it shows both why defining transition activities are difficult, and also explains why very few taxonomies around the world have a sophisticated approach on how to do that. But it also speaks to why it's really, really important for Canada to do this, given how emissions intensive our economy is. And that came up also in the last panel. Canada has an opportunity to provide some leadership here in terms of defining that transition space. But that paper lays out in agonizing detail what types of metrics and thresholds would be required to have a science-based, credible label for any types of oil and gas activities. And so the idea would be to kind of roll that out, that same sort of framework, for all sorts of different activities and sectors across the economy. We started with oil and gas because it is the hardest, and I think we'll shed light on how to move forward with other sectors. But if anyone's interested, it's available on our website, climateinstitute.ca.
Thanks. And I know we'll get into Canada as a leader on this a little bit later on, but for now, I would like to turn to you, Roger. Addenda Capital is an investment management firm that looks after pension, private wealth, insurance, corporate, and foundation assets. How and why are you guys focused on the climate transition?
Well, hi, Sarah. Thanks for having me. Well, as an asset manager, that's one thing, but we're also part of the Cooperators family, and that's a cooperative that is really focused on general insurance and life insurance. And as an insurer, we've really been understanding how climate change is a direct threat to the financial security of Canadians right now. I mean, we just have to just look at the media any day, and more so now as we come into summer. It'll become crisper and crisper to all of us. So right up front, that's a challenge that we really want to face. And as an asset manager tied into that group, then we understood the science behind it. And so what we're trying to do now is really making sure that the threats to the communities, the threats to the companies, the threats to the economy that this presents is really handled to better to allocate capital. And so we really want to toggle on the risks and opportunities that are involved here, because not only there's a risk issue that obviously from a climate change perspective, but as we've been talking about, there's a transition at play. There has to be a transition at play, and that creates a whole raft of opportunities. So I think that's a very important part. We are also involved, as the previous panel talked about, SFAC. So the Sustainable Finance Action Council, Cooperators was part of that, and we were very involved in doing some of that work. And so that really helped us better understand the issues as well. And then secondly, the Cooperators is also a net zero asset owner. So they're committed to use their assets and to get them onto net zero by 2050. And so we've signed on as an asset manager. We don't manage our own assets. We manage our clients' assets, and we've signed on as a net zero asset manager and trying to work with our clients to get to their portfolios and make sure their portfolios are net zero, but also using their portfolios to help the economy get to net zero. So it's really science-based. We're trying to make the best allocation possible to mitigate the risks, so lower the risk, but also create opportunities and seize those opportunities in the portfolios as we go through.
I'm going to actually stay with you for one more question, Roger. How will the taxonomy help Canada move forward with the energy transition specifically? And, we all know Canada is very resource driven as an economy. So maybe you can help us out with that a bit.
Absolutely. So Jonathan sort of touched on it earlier, and the previous panel as well. The transition actually in Canada is actually a bigger challenge because we are an industrial country. We have huge amounts of extraction. We have energy extractions. We generate power. And also we're a very large country. So our transportation sector is a very significant sector for our economy. Therefore, when you think about it, actually, using the taxonomies, I kind of hate that word, I think, because clients always think of tax, and we have, our industry has to figure out, I mean, I know it's a classification scheme, and I remember it, Jonathan, from high school, I do, but it's just not a good word. Using a taxonomy in Europe is actually, they have no extraction. They have very little power generation. So it's simpler to do a taxonomy in Europe. So for Canada, it's a harder subject. but it's even more important because we need to transition. We need to get to the other side, and we need to accompany our clients. We need to accompany our economy to create opportunities, but also to change where the way we're doing things, because we cannot keep on going the way we're doing. But we have a strong hand in the sense that we have a strong economy. Let's use that economy as a lever to get to the other side. So the taxonomy is really making sure that capital can get allocated. Capital requires two things. This is actually a business. This is a market's way of dealing with the problem. We need to incent pricing, so we need to reflect correct pricing, and then we need to create ground rules, so security around how the market's going to work. If we can create those two things by actually using a science-based taxonomy, so a classification schemes for investments, then that means that we'll make capital allocations into the right places, and we'll do those so for a long time. The challenge is immense. We're talking about something over $125 billion a year. But that's a huge opportunity. That's money that can flow into Canada if we can orient it the right way, and if investors understand where the transition is going to happen. And that's why that taxonomy is so important to Canadians.
Thank you. And everyone missed the heavy nods when you made that comment about the word taxonomy. But this actually transitions really nicely into a question I have for you, Fate. Why is it important to build industry alignment around the taxonomy? And I know you mentioned earlier about shifting from a voluntary to a mandatory approach. Maybe you could start there.
Yeah, sure. And I think I've been using the term framework, Roger, in our organization, because I know just a bit of, if I can go on just a quick tangent, California, Republican state often, right? But the Republicans had introduced, all kinds of cap and trade systems around their carbon tax or carbon management, and they never referred to it as tax. So anytime you use, that was like part of the brilliance behind it and how they marketed it to their own citizens. And I think that's a really important comment and something that we should most definitely be considering. So maybe maybe before Sierra, I know in our pre-call we talked about voluntary versus mandatory, but maybe if I can start with why this is important and how this is meant to align. And I think Roger and Jonathan both provided some really great speaking points to this. So in our industry, and even when we talk to beyond our industry, and the big language that we sometimes create and use, we are confusing Canadians as well with some of the language we're using. And there's a lack of consistency in how we all apply. If I think about mutual funds as an example, we all have different definitions of what's a green fund, what's a transition fund, what's a climate aligned fund. And I think what this taxonomy can really ultimately do, and I believe the vision behind it, is to get us all speaking the same language, which then starts to allow some of the capital allocation opportunities that Roger was referring to. So we all need to agree that these are the set of transition activities. Here's what they mean. Here's how we're going to define them. This is the set of green activities. And so what happens there is then we all start aligning to those and reporting against those activities, which will essentially create that alignment. In terms of voluntary versus mandatory, I think I'm very excited by the Canadian Sustainability Standards Boards. That's also a mouthful. By the consultations that they have out for reporting in Canada, and I think there's a couple of things that need to happen. I'm hopeful that reporting will become mandatory in this country, because then all corporates will be required to report in a consistent manner. And so then this will be complemented by this taxonomy, where then, hopefully at some point we bring them both together and we're able to really have robust reporting for investors and portfolio managers to really think about how they're designing products, how they're making allocation decisions, and essentially will have a better and maybe more simplified way of bringing that to the market to Canadians. So not sure if I've answered the voluntary or versus mandatory piece, but I think the foundation has to start with what the CSSB is doing and then complemented by this work.
Thank you. I actually see Jonathan might have something to add here.
Yeah, and it's just to build on Faith's comment about how taxonomies can help align capital allocation with our climate objectives. The flip side of that is that capital is misallocated, and it's important to note here that even just small differences between how capital is allocated versus how they align or not align with the climate objectives of the country, of the world, make huge differences over time. And if you think about the longevity and lifespan of some of the projects that we're talking about, sometimes 20, 30 plus years, the way capital is allocated today matters for the future. So the sooner that we can get this type of, I'm going to call it market infrastructure. I agree. I don't care what you call it, taxonomy, whatever, but we need this sort of tool to improve how capital is being allocated today, because it's going to reverberate through time in really important ways.
Thank you. I actually do have one more for Faith that I will turn to now. In the absence of the green and transition taxonomy in Canada, we know there's inherently been a lot of uncertainty and hesitation, specifically among investors. How can a robust taxonomy address some of this, what we call inertia, among portfolio managers?
Yeah, that's a great question. We operate in a capital markets consumes a lot of data, and so that consistency. You think about financial reporting, which fuels a lot of the investment decisions that we all make today. That doesn't necessarily, and it doesn't exist in a consistent manner on the sustainability side or on the ESG front. And so a taxonomy like this, again, coupled with a robust corporate reporting, will ensure that we have consistent, reliable data, so investors can make that's what we need to gain confidence in the investment decisions that we're making. And you saw this playing out in Europe, which I think they've had a couple of bumps there. It wasn't a perfect process in how they rolled out their green taxonomy, but they're there, and a lot of the ESG data providers have now adopted those taxonomies and are able to play back and report alignment from at a corporate level, that company's alignment to the European taxonomy, or like a mutual fund, so they can roll up investments or portfolios and report back to you their alignment to that taxonomy. So again, I think we disclosure is really important, and these frameworks will really help to set us and get us all on the same page for consistent, reliable data and reporting.
Thank you. And sorry, my last one for you, Faith, I promise. How are you applying sustainable finance now, and where do you see potential for expansion? For example, we talk a lot about sustainability-linked loans, but we don't talk as much about the equity side.
Yeah, that's a great question. So on the equity side, so we do apply in a couple of different ways. We do report to clients, and we do report to clients against the EU taxonomy, where clients have asked us. So we look and see that portfolio and the revenue being generated from the underlying companies. How does that align to the European taxonomy? And then that helps us to dictate whether that fund is, how to categorize that fund. And in Europe, they're using language like Article 8 and Article 9, with Article 9 being very green in nature. We do have some investment boutiques like our Greenship boutique, where they've created their own green taxonomy. And so teams like mine would adopt that. And as we report to that team, we ensure that we're taking those types of activities into consideration and reporting back what their alignment is. So their alignment would be upwards of 70% plus, because that's a key consideration and input into their process. So I think in terms of how equities can use this, it very much will need to be revenue driven and focused on the types of products and services that that company is producing, and how those products or services align with the taxonomy. I think one of the things that we didn't touch on today is the notion of do no significant harm, which is a consideration in the European taxonomy, and I know is a consideration in the one that Canada, or in the draft one that Canada released a year and a half or almost 2 years ago. So I think hey, you're a green company, awesome, but let's just make sure that you're not committing any human rights violations or dumping waste through your operations and producing solar panels or wind farms on the other end. So I think those are all important considerations that we've built into our process.
And I'm going to actually turn it back over to you, Roger. There's this urgency building around the risk of Canada getting left behind in global markets if we continue to drag our heels on this. And we heard about this a little bit earlier in the other discussion too. What is happening with taxonomies internationally, and how does Canada compare?
Well, we're falling behind. There are now over 40 developed countries that have taxonomies. And you have also some significant resource-rich countries that have put them in place. Brazil, Australia. Australia is a great example. They relied very heavily on the work Canada did, which is very frustrating, right? So, and why is that? Is because they want to attract capital. They want to attract capital to help their economies make the change. And you've got investors across the world that are more and more motivated by this, and that they know that they want to make a difference. They know they can get their financial returns, and they want to make sure that their capital helps steer the economy into the right place and provide for opportunities in the future. So that's a very important one. So we started this work in 2019, the financial community in Canada. And the good news is it was in the budget yesterday, and it was put in. Again, not to solve it, but they called it out, and they said that they'd be back in the fall. So let's hope that it's something significant in the fall, because right now we have $15 billion being invested into Canada. We need to bring that up to 125, and that's a very significant number. But that's money flowing into our economies, and so that is very significant. And again, the international modus operandi is getting ahead of us. So we need to catch up, and we need to do it our way, because we have a very significant energy sector, but we can't just ignore it,
Thanks. Faye, did you have something that you wanted to add on this?
Yeah, I did. I think to build on Roger's comments, what you're going to find and what we're finding is in some of our more green oriented funds, the investment then is not in Canada. It's going to Europe. It's going to China, right? They're leaders now in solar and wind. We know the Middle East is doubling down as well. So I really think even from Canadian asset managers that want to be invested in this country, it's very challenging to find those types of projects and those activities in this country. And that's really unfortunate, because we should be going here first.
100%. Thank you, guys. Jonathan, I'm going to turn back to you with one more question. How or where will the taxonomy interact with other policies in Canada to help achieve a lower carbon economy?
Yeah, it's a really important question. And the way that we think about this is that the taxonomy is one tool of many that governments can deploy to both help meet our domestic emissions targets, as well as position the Canadian economy for success, long-term success in the energy transition. So the taxonomy is a complement to other types of policies like carbon pricing, like regulations. To Roger's point earlier, you have to price the externality. Like, that is kind of fundamental to dealing with the issue of climate change, to make sure that the price that we're paying reflects the damages that we're causing on the environment. So that's I think the starting point, and then the taxonomy layered on top of that again is to help steer how money is allocated in the economy, so that these two things work together. In terms of you have a price on carbon, for example, that encourages or increases the incentive to invest in certain activities, and then the taxonomy kind of clarifies what is aligned, what is not aligned, so they can work in tandem. They can also be used in terms of how governments think about spending, which is also, I think, really important and often overlooked, especially when we think about subsidies to new and emerging technologies. governments can use taxonomies as a way of prioritizing what they're spending scarce dollars on. And so we've provided some initial analysis around how the taxonomy, for example, could be used to have a more rigorous definition of fossil fuel subsidies, for example, and that kind of relates to the paper that I mentioned earlier in the conversation. But really, there are a lot of use cases for how a taxonomy can be applied in practice. I've named a few of them, but there's lots of opportunities here to go above and beyond kind of how it's traditionally used in other jurisdictions so far.
Thank you for that. Roger, do you want to jump in with something?
Yeah, yes, just in a way, what I think is fundamental here is taxonomy is required. It's a policy signal, but after that, it's a market solution, right? This is letting markets solve the problem, but markets just need to the incentive as to where it needs to go and the rules of the game, right? And if you can do that with a science-based approach and a framework, then you let the markets go. So this is not about government overreach. This is not government spending. No, quite to the contrary. So I think we really have to really make people understand that much better is how this is a market solution. And we need to give the price signals, and then we need to give the ground rules.
Thank you for that. And we've covered a bunch of different things from a bunch of different perspectives as well. I was hoping before letting us go, maybe I can ask you guys for some sort of takeaway or closing thought that we can leave our audience with. I don't want to put anyone on the spot, but if anyone has a thought, I would love to turn to you first.
I can kick off. I think I agree fully with everything Roger and Jonathan said today, and specifically around the budget and whether this is just doubling down that I would have loved to see more in the budget now on more support for the taxonomy and moving this forward, and also that this is a framework or classification to help capital markets, to help investors. It's not meant to, I think there's a lot of diverging views around this topic, and this is really meant to be a classification by which we can better speak to investors on how we're investing and where we're investing. And I think it's should be a really important consideration for the government in terms of just putting that forward and solidifying it for us without turning it into a big policy discussion. Thank you. Either Roger or Jonathan.
Yeah, I think just the last point for me is that it's a hard thing. Like the thing is, climate is not going away, and climate change is not political, right? So we just have to deal with it, and this is what science is giving us as an indication. So, and it may not be perfect, but we need to do more, and we need to get going. And if it's not perfect, then we can fix it next year. We can fix it with time. But we need to start because it's happening. It's already in the pipeline with regards to climate change that there's already affecting communities. And the longer we wait to try to make it perfect, the more time we lose, and actually the more damage we're doing, and the more opportunity we're squandering. Thank you. And last, I'm going to throw it to you, Jonathan.
Yeah, just to build on Roger's point there, I think first of all, it comes down to the competitiveness of the Canadian economy and thinking about competitiveness in the long term in the energy transition. And so the taxonomy that we've proposed is all about defining transition risk as well as transition opportunity, and again providing those market signals for capital markets. So I think that relates to the second point I wanted to make, is that it's very easy to overcomplicate this. Taxonomies, they almost immediately make your eyes glaze over because they can become very technical and complex very quickly. We're not talking about anything new here, really, and the amount of money required to get this off the ground is tiny in relation to the benefits that it could have. So I think there's a lot of momentum here that Canada can build on, but at the end of the day, We have all the tools necessary. We have all of the people in Canada in this ecosystem ready to do this, and we just need to hit the green light.
Thank you. We're going to have to leave it there, but thank you guys so much, Faye, Roger, and Jonathan, for being here with me today. Coming up next, we're going to hear from businesses. So that's including Aecon, Agnico Eagle, and First Nations Bank Trust on how they're shifting their approaches to ESG reporting and risk assessment. Dr. Bruce Lowry from the Ivy Foundation is also on deck.
Welcome back, everyone. I hope you enjoyed the break. My name is Ryan McDonald. I'm a senior editor at The Globe. I lead the team of climate, environment, and energy journalists here at The Globe, and I'm going to be moderating our next discussion. Through the course of the afternoon, we've heard about a lot of interesting things around regulatory changes related to sustainable finance. The last seminar with Sierra, a colleague of mine at The Globe, was fascinating. I got a chance to tune into a bit of it, listening to the description of the inertia in green taxonomy in Canada, and some of the questions around capital flows and how markets are pushing. One takeaway from that panel that I took was, I think it was one of the panelists said, climate change is not political. I think that's interesting. I'm here in Ottawa. We just had a budget. There's a lot of talk about climate change in relation to taxation. But today and this afternoon, we're here to talk about how companies are dealing with sustainability issues. So I'd like to introduce our panelists. We've got about 40 minutes to talk about each company, your goals. So I think we can begin with a bit of an overview of what you're doing at your various companies. So here we go. First of all, I'd like to introduce Mohammed Ali. He is Vice President of Sustainability and Regulatory Affairs with Agnico Eagle. That's a global mining company. Their headquarters are just down the street from the Globe and Mail in Toronto. Next, we have Prab Banga. Prab is Vice President of Sustainability with Aecon Group, Inc., which is a natural infrastructure company. I'm sure you've seen all kinds of Aecon signs. They are building all kinds of infrastructure across Canada. And finally, we have Suzanne Trottier. Suzanne is President of First Nations Bank of Canada Trust, based in Saskatoon. So thank you all for joining us. I'm happy to jump right in here. As I said at the outset, I think it would be, I think it's probably important to just talk a bit about each of your companies and some of your goals in relation to our discussion today. So why don't we start with you, Mohammed? And I mean, I cover mining. I hope everyone's been following our critical minerals series, but perhaps you could tell us a little bit about Agnico Eagle's sustainability and net zero targets, just to kick us off.
Absolutely. Good afternoon, everybody. As Ryan mentioned, I'm Mohammed Ali. Agnico Eagle Mines, I will say that I always start off whenever I present somewhere that as soon as people hear about mining or mining company, until recently with the critical minerals push, it's always been that that sector that's behind the scenes, that's doing all the work in getting all the materials that we need to maintain our modern industrial society. The mining sector's always had challenges, but there's been quite a lot of advancements. Within my space, when I got started, when I came out of school, my first task, I wanted to be in sustainability before it was coined, to do a carbon footprint, and it was for mining sector. They were ahead of the curve on doing a lot of this stuff before a lot of the other sectors, and I ended up in mining. Agnico Eagle Mines is right now, by market cap, second, third largest gold mining company in the world. We are the largest operator in Canada in mining in general, and a variety of things that we've always factored in, just because mining is so heavily regulated, in factoring in lands and indigenous nations, etc. But in terms of some of our sustainability goals and targets at the moment, just at least for the intro, like a lot of companies out there, Agnico Eagle is also committed to a net zero by 2050 and a 30% reduction by 2030. We've got various commitments on Indigenous participation, land reclamation, etc. So I'll stop there because I think there's going to be quite a lot of topic on the specifics.
Of course. Thanks for the background. I appreciate you sharing some of the history of why you got into this field. Prab, what about you? I mean, I think Aecon is a company that most Canadians would be familiar with in terms of, I mean, you're really building a lot of the infrastructure that in some cases is related to, the transition to a low carbon economy. But maybe you can talk a bit about what sort of targets you're working with at Aecon.
Yeah, for sure. So, like you mentioned, Aecon doesn't need an introduction. You've probably seen our vehicles across Canada working on various projects. And right now, the focus for us is really working on energy transition infrastructure. We're doing Canada's largest and first battery storage facility, which is the Oneida Battery Storage Facility. So in terms of our own targets on the ESG side, similar to Mohammed, we also have a target of getting to net zero by 2050 and an interim target of getting to 30% reduction by 2030. We actually just yesterday, hot off the press, got a letter from the Science Based Target Initiative saying that our targets have been approved by SBTI. And if anyone has gone through this process, they know how rigorous it is to get your targets validated by SBTI. So we're really excited about that. And then in addition to environmental targets, we also have targets related to Indigenous spend on the procurement side, as well as targets related to diversity and inclusion, specifically focusing on women in trades. And then we do have a sustainability linked loan. So a lot of our key ESG targets are associated and linked to our sustainability linked loan.
I'd love to get back to the SBTI discussion, and maybe you can share a little bit more. I mean, I think part of the way the webinar has unfolded today, I hope we can get into some of the pragmatic kind of questions and have you folks share some of your stories on dealing with some of these issues, and hopefully we can have other businesses learn from your experiences too. You mentioned Oneida. I mean, obviously, Indigenous participation in this transition to the low carbon economy is massive and interesting and necessary. Suzanne, you come at this from a slightly different tact. I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about the work that you're doing at First Nations Bank Trust.
Sure. Thank you so much, Ryan. Thank you for having me here today. So my name's Suzanne Trottier. I'm Métis, born and raised in Manitoba with maternal roots to the Lake Manitoba and Ebb and Flow First Nations. I head First Nation Bank of Canada's wholly owned trust company called FNB Trust. So we administer over $4 billion in First Nations monies related to either settlements that they receive for breach of treaty, breach of their rights, or whether it's economic development initiatives like a wind farm where they've got profits that they would like to set aside and grow for many generations to come. So from our perspective and what we hear from our clients is the need for more disclosure around companies and their efforts around Indigenous rights and the respect and recognition of those rights. So I think we'll probably get into more around that, but it's something where our clients want to know if their trust monies are invested in a company that's in active litigation with another First Nation, whether that's in Canada, whether it's in South America, if it's that the rights are not being respected, there hasn't been free, prior, and informed consent, because they really want to be able to make informed decisions around their investments and make sure that their money is not going against the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples.
Yeah, I thank you for bringing up disclosure. I mean, I think that really is a big part of what we're here to discuss. So this is the part of the program where we flood the zone with a lot of acronyms. there's the TCFD, there's the TNFD. Prab talked about the SBTI. There's a lot of different reporting standards. There's a lot of protocols. There's been some coalescing around different protocols, but as companies, I'm just wondering, we can start with you, Mohammed. How do you navigate this disclosure arena, and what is your approach?
Well, you do. When you mentioned these acronyms, I was going to keep adding more to it, but it is as an industry and as a business, it's one of the most challenging things to navigate. We all understand disclosure is important. We all want to find ways to provide some disclosure. And you mentioned the TCFD and TNFD, and then there's sector-specific disclosure. So within the sector we operate in, we have the TSM, which is towards sustainable mining. We have the Responsible Gold Mining Principles, which is the RGMP, and then we have the GRI. In that list, overall, what happens is, if I was to give an analogy for those who are listening and hearing all these acronyms, I always say the ingredients are all the same. We're all talking about the right things. We all want to do the right thing, but it's just that every one of them is making a different cake with the same ingredients. And the challenge we have is that a lot of these, let's say, reporting disclosure standards that have emerged because, as Suzanne said, there might be some focus on Indigenous, more transparency on Indigenous, or there might be some more transfer or disclosure transparency on sustainable finance and linked loans, as Prab was saying. The problem is, when all of those different ones that have different focus, when you try to put it all together, they all don't want the same report. So we end up having to do separate reports for all of them. And then what happens is, now at some point, you're wondering, are you doing this because of sustainability and ESG and business integration needs? Or are you doing it to meet a tick box exercise of everybody who's asking for everything? And then you're trying to just get these reports out. So the couple things I'd like to say, that's just the voluntary space and some of those, but then there's a new standards and things that are coming that I think we can probably segue into later. But ultimately, some form of convergence into this would be the right space to go, because we all want to do the right thing.
Yeah, I mean, that's such a good point. The ticking of the boxes, I think, was the early thoughts around disclosure and ESG, and I mean, in Europe and other places around the world, things are becoming much more standardized. Prab, what can you share a bit of your experience? I mean, I know obviously there are lots of things to report. I am kind of interested in the nature disclosure part of this, and I heard that maybe you had recently started some work on that.
Yeah, so we wanted to be early adopters of TNFD, just the nature of our business, no pun intended, but we do infrastructure projects in environmentally sensitive areas. So we wanted to get an early start on actually looking at how TNFD would apply to our operations. So we actually tried to line it up with our existing environmental management system that we have in place that our teams would use to assess environmental impacts and mitigate environmental impacts of the projects that we're undertaking. So I would say we did a very early assessment. We published it in our 2023 sustainability report, but there's lots more to be done. There is that double materiality piece to it as well, and looking at the financial impacts as well. So that's something we plan on expanding on in the next report. And that's a key point of just reporting in general, is that for any company that's looking to start, I know the alphabet soup, as I like to refer to all these acronyms, can be overwhelming, but it's good to start with. I mean, you don't have to start with all of the reporting frameworks all at once. It is a journey, and you can build on it every year. And I would say to start off with the ones that are most relevant to your industry, and then also most relevant to your stakeholders. So when I started with Aecon about 4 years ago. We had just produced our first sustainability report, but what we did was we undertook stakeholder engagement. We met with our investors, we met with employees, surveyed them, and kind of did this assessment to see what would you use the sustainability report for? What are you looking for? What type of information are you looking for? We asked our investors about which sustainability frameworks we should align to, and that really helped us to determine which frameworks would be most relevant to our audience. Mohammed also mentioned sector supplements. So many of the reporting frameworks have specific sector supplements. So there's one for the construction industry within SASB. So we decided to start off with SASB, which is the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board. They specifically have one for construction and infrastructure. And we said, okay, so let's start off by aligning to that one. And every year we've added on to it. So this year, the latest edition was TNFD. We also added the new IFRS. So I'm sure we'll talk more about those, the Canadian Sustainability Standards Board recommendations on reporting for publicly traded companies in Canada. So we added those. So it is a journey, and companies should ensure that they're taking into consideration stakeholder feedback in terms of producing the report and really thinking about who your audience is and how they're accessing information about your ESG performance.
Yeah, I mean, you must deal a lot with municipalities in terms of building out that infrastructure. And I know there are a lot of municipalities that have really pushed the idea of nature-related solutions as well. So I can see there'd probably be some alignment there.
Yeah, for sure. We actually, I recently was on a call with City of Toronto's environment manager talking about the Toronto Green Building Standards. And many municipalities across Canada, Ottawa, City of Vancouver, have their own version of those green building standards. And a component of those green building standards is to look at impacts on nature when you're undertaking projects or even like looking at retrofits for existing infrastructure as well.
Mm-hmm. Prab also mentioned, I mean, I think broadly the relevance of disclosure. Suzanne, obviously you come at this from the standpoint of impact on Indigenous communities. You did mention a little bit about what you'd like to see in terms of increased disclosure around Indigenous communities, but maybe you could expand to explain that a bit more.
Yeah, so I think what we see now coming from companies is primarily outputs, so things like the number of jobs that Indigenous peoples are holding in their company, the impact benefit agreements, that there's compensation that's going, there's training programs, and those are all great. And I think that's good to see that. Where we're seeing that there's less disclosure is around the impact on the First Nations, whether it's to their watershed, whether it's a dam, whether it's the pipeline going through their traditional territories, whether it's lithium mining, you name it. Like it's how are the First Nations being consulted on the projects and whether they're working with that nation or the affected Indigenous people in which the company is operating, how are they actually working with that nation to ensure that the watershed is protected according to their standards or to their needs to carry on their traditional fishing and hunting. So it's taking it to a different level, which really what I was speaking of earlier was the free, prior, and informed consent, because that really, it takes a lot of time. And it takes the company having the right people at the table in terms of understanding and being able to work with that First Nation. Like an example would be one of our clients is in partnership with a company for a wind farm, and that company worked with the nation who has its own environmental standards to really mitigate the environmental risks to the fowl, the watershed that was around the wind turbines. And so that's an excellent example. And how do you capture that in disclosures, as Mohammed was saying? Like there's so many different reports and disclosures, but really that's super important for our clients. And as I said, it's $4 billion and growing in terms of the money that these nations have. So it's significant, and we're just one of many companies who are administering First Nations monies.
So you're seeing investors demand this increasingly. Is that what you're saying?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Well, I mean, we have Mohammed here who happens to run a mine, and there are mines in the Canadian Arctic that I believe you employ a lot of Indigenous people. So maybe you can jump off from what Suzanne was saying about, how do you deal with those kind of disclosures that are a little bit more, I guess, these are the surface issues, or surface rights issues, where it's not just about how many Indigenous people are employed, but what kind of effect you're having in that community.
This subject, I'm really happy that we got into this, especially, and thank you, Suzanne, for giving me the opportunity here, because the mining sector, you could argue in terms of where mining and metals, and in terms of how old the industry is, and that industry over time itself has matured. And the problem is, just like any industry, perceptions, etc., what's the mining of today versus the mining of yesterday. And we still have a lot of work to do with our mining peers to work in the space. But unequivocally, mining doesn't happen in the middle of Toronto. It doesn't happen in where we see. It's happening in our Indigenous communities. It's happening in lands where most of the folks here may not realize what's happening. So therefore, what Suzanne's mentioning, yes, most places and most companies will disclose their royalty payments. They'll disclose the wages, how much the participation, involvement, and training and culture. Within the extractive sector, there's a report called Estima, and that provides you the financial contribution. But to take it beyond that, in terms of FPIC and UNDRIP, what Suzanne was mentioning, those are the fundamental building blocks to get to the next layer of disclosure. To me, is now these communities who are there, who are impacted, once you've gotten past that, now those communities are saying, okay, we now are in partnership with this project. Now, we don't want to just have a royalty. We want partnerships in here. We would like to have participation. How do we build businesses? How do we build our own economic backbone so that we are part of the economy and not a bystander? So a lot of what Agnico has been doing is putting those partnerships in place, because we'd like to say, okay, here's a business. We know we're going to need it. You're in the community. It makes good business sense because they're local folks. If there's upskilling required or initial investments, now you've got a cement plant, you've got batch plants, you've got businesses that then scale out and work their way out, and they've got independence, because economic reconciliation isn't just about handouts. And that's the part that I think the mining sector does quietly behind the scenes. But I will say that there's some that aren't working so well. And this is an evolving subject in itself.
Mm-hmm. I mean, obviously, the issue of Indigenous partnerships is an important one. Prab, you mentioned Oneida. Is this something that these are the kind of conversations that that you're having with investors around this sort of evolving view of ESG and sustainable finance?
Yeah, for sure. It's one of, I mentioned sustainability linked loan. Our goal related to Indigenous spend is one of our metrics for our sustainability linked loan. And similar to what Mohammed said, it's really about economic opportunity, and we really strongly believe in creating those economic opportunities. So over the last couple of years, we've been announcing a lot of joint ventures, where it's joint ventures with Indigenous groups and Indigenous businesses. So an example is A6N, which is a joint venture with the Grand Rivers Indigenous group, and that is a 49-51% split between us and A6N. And we have many other examples of such opportunities where we've gone out and partnered with Indigenous businesses and created joint ventures to undertake projects. There's the AECON Mackles Power 7 Generation, acronym is AMP 7G joint venture as well. We're working together on doing high voltage transmission projects across Ontario. So that's Indigenous partnerships, Indigenous joint venture is a huge focus area for us. It's part of our reconciliation action plan to be creating these economic opportunities.
Well, let's stay with it just for maybe one more question, I think, and then we can. I'd like to evolve the conversation a little bit to, I think, get at some of the things that were mentioned in the previous panels, which is really, I think, the notion of ESG's evolution to kind of, risk and competitiveness, and what that means for your companies. But Suzanne, I was just wondering if you could share some thoughts on just related to disclosure and whether or not investors are starting to view the lack of disclosure of Indigenous impact as a, I guess, to a certain extent, a material risk.
Yes, I would say definitely it does present, could present material risks, whether it's because it's, I mean, we don't have to look too far. You can look to the natural gas pipeline in BC with the Wet'suwet'en. That's an example of a risk that wasn't properly mitigated, and just understanding the decision making of the Wet'suwet'en, the hereditary chiefs and the elected chiefs and council. And so I think that's an example of a material risk, right, that has had consequences on that pipeline and project. So, and there's many other examples. So I think it is something that goes beyond, I mean, economic reconciliation and the partnerships that Prad and Mohammed have been speaking of are fantastic. And that is just so great. And all of our clients are seeking or have these types of partnerships. That's really part of bringing Indigenous people into the mainstream economy, which is where we want to go. In terms of the material risks, I think it is something that disclosures are still not quite getting at, especially related to, like, you can take railways, for example, that do pass through a lot of the traditional territories of First Nations and Indigenous people in Canada. And so there could be some risks there in terms of, are those nations being compensated? Have they been, did they give their consent for that? So these are risks that there does need to be disclosures on, for sure.
Maybe we can talk a little bit now about challenges. I mean, the ESG field and the reporting related to it has evolved quite a bit over the years. I'm wondering if maybe Mohammed and Prab, you could talk about specific challenges that you bump into. Obviously, you mentioned off the top the SBTI and the difficulty of getting that sign off. But Mohammed, maybe we can start with you and then go to Prab and talk about the challenges that you're facing.
Sure. I think the first challenge I think they've already addressed is that the whole alphabet soup and trying to produce 5 different reports that have the same ingredients just presented differently. But I think the emerging challenge we have is now these reports. I think the public as well as the investment community is starting to understand there's a lot of reports here, but how is this decision useful? What am I going to do with this information? Which one is of use to me? And so the emergence of now sustainability linked to finance, with the emergence of the CSRD, with ASIC in Australia, with the ESRS in Europe, or CSRD, and then you've got USSE and CSSB, which I sit on the board for the CSSB, which is the Canadian Sustainability Standards Board. It's now creating a world of mandatory reporting with a focus on materiality or double materiality based on where you are. And what they want to know is, instead of you presenting just oogles and oogles of data, give me what's decision useful. What are the risks? What are the financial impacts? And what are the opportunities? It's a promising looking area because in theory, you want to move towards decision useful information. So for example, if I work in the mining sector, Prab works in infrastructure and construction, and Suzanne's in the finance, our sustainability reports aren't even comparable. Whatever I put out has nothing to do compared with the investment community is trying to compare across sectors. So the challenge we have is when something like TNFD comes out or SBTI comes out, it's hard to encompass all sectors. The mining sector is a cyclical sector. we're not making widgets forever. We're not just generating power forever. We have an asset that comes on and comes offline. So those generalized standards are they're not all fit for purpose for everyone. The second challenge is that financial information right now, we're going to go through some hiccups until we get it right. But once we do, and we really truly look at materiality, I think we'll be in a better place. But the challenge is each region is coming up with their own mandatory reporting, which then turns that alphabet soup into a mandatory alphabet soup. How we go, we'll find out. I do think we'll come to something where it's decision useful.
You've mentioned some solutions there, but I mean, how much does all of this weigh on the CSSB? I mean, what's your feeling? I mean, who really needs to show the leadership?
So in terms of the companies or the actual CSSBs, the standard setters?
The setters, I guess. I mean, how do we make this easier for companies, I guess, is my point.
I think the thing is, if I were to be completely naive about it, if we had the standard setting, and it's up to the standard setter of each region to say, okay, we're adopting a standard that is being adopted somewhere else. For example, the one the ISSB came out, the IFRS, when the Canadian standard came, we understood that the Indigenous content is one that we would like to put extra emphasis because that's just the Canadian way. So when everyone starts making their own little tweaks, it'd be useful if everyone just created a singular standard, and the leadership should be among standards. So to me, we're going to crawl before we're going to run. So step one, let's get all the nations together to understand the importance of the sustainability decision useful information that's linked to investments and or financial impact. Then we'll probably come to some consolidation, because ultimately investors are saying, I don't want to look at region specific reports. I want one standardized report. Then you're going to get the trickled information of if there's a risk with an Indigenous community or a risk because you're going to be impacting nature, the financial impacts will be quantified because you have to legally disclose if there's a risk. And therefore, now you're getting the material useful information, because maybe Prob's work on a building in downtown Toronto may or may not have as direct impact as my mine that's in an Indigenous community right next to where they live and do practice traditional rights. So the materiality is going to play the big role, and I think it's going to be a 4 or 5 year process, my personal opinion.
That's a lot from Mohammed.
Until we get it right. I think we're going to get a lot of reports that are going to have a lot of information that isn't decision useful because we're trying to make it work. This is information that ESG professionals, financial professionals, and lawyers are trying to get together to form. I think it's not going to be right away. And that's why I do think that we'll get there. We'll get there over time, because I think through refinement and iterative processes, we'll get it right.
Yeah, I mean, it sort of harkens back to the previous panel too on green taxonomy. I mean, you need to get it right to make sure that the capital flows can get it right too. Prab, do you want to pick up on anything that you heard there in terms of challenges and solutions?
Yeah, for sure. So echo definitely everything that Mohammed said. To build on that, I think one area that companies are dealing with right now is scope 3 emissions. So that is indirect greenhouse gas emissions. Mohammed mentioned that one of his first assignments that he did was carbon accounting. So I mean, that's an assignment that a lot of companies are probably doing right now, and much easier to do it for your direct emissions, so scope 1 and 2, but a lot more challenging to do it for scope 3, which is working with your suppliers and understanding emissions from your supply chain. That's a huge challenge. It's been a huge challenge because everyone's sort of trying to figure it out at the same time. So our scope 3 emissions are supplier scope 1 and 2 emissions, and how to determine what our portion of them are. And then for us, materials, the materials that we procure for our construction projects, cement being one of the largest emitters, determining the quantities that are used on site. So I think just as reporting becomes mandatory around emissions, I think scope 3 will be challenging, and I think that there's going to be a requirement of collaboration amongst industries to come up with solutions to get access to scope 3 data. Although the Securities Exchange Commission in the US has put it on pause for now, but the plan was for them to require publicly traded companies to report on their indirect emissions. In California, there was an announcement for companies over a certain profit amount must be reporting on their scope 3 emissions. So a lot of collaboration is going to be required there. If you are aligning your targets to SBTI, SBTI has a requirement for scope 3 emission reporting as well. Second challenge, Mohammed kind of alluded to as well, is working with your finance teams, and not that working with your finance teams is a challenge itself, but just thinking about where sustainability sits in the future in terms of sustainability reporting. Sustainability teams put a lot of resources in producing their sustainability report, but then we kind of think about what's the future of this report going to be? Does it become disseminated into other financial documents, such as your management disclosure and other financial documents? It goes through the same cadence of your financial reports being audited. So does it become integrated into those? So those are conversations that we're having now as we turn to the CSSB and look at what their recommendations are that are coming out. We're thinking about what does that mean for our sustainability report, and does it become something that's integrated into existing financial documents?
That's great. I mean, I want to get your perspective on this, Suzanne, as well, in terms of challenges that you see from your perspective. But I just had one more question for Prab, which is, you did share your SBTI validation story off the top. What can you tell us about that? I mean, how long did it take? What was the most frustrating part of that process? How did you overcome it? Anything that would be helpful for another company that's going through that process?
Yeah, so for us, it was about a 3-year process from the time that we initially filed what they would refer to as like an interest letter saying that we want to get our targets validated. And then in those 3 years, we essentially went through the SBTI checklist, which required us to do our emissions inventory with determining what our baseline is going to be. Emissions inventory has to follow the greenhouse gas emissions protocol, which is international standards for conducting an emissions inventory. And then we also had to do what SBTI refers to as a scope 3 scan. So within scope 3, there's 13 different categories, and a company would have to determine which ones are most material to their company. So in our case, it's our subcontractors, suppliers, and materials. And then once you complete that, then you set a target for your scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 emissions. And then from the time that you file all of that information, it takes about 6 months of back and forth, like SBTI asking questions about what your organizational boundaries are, what's included, what's not included, and then providing justification for specific categories of emissions that aren't included. So providing justification for those. So yeah, all in all, about a 3-year process.
Wow, you make it sound pretty simple, but I mean, you're a very complex company with a lot of things going on. Congratulations. I did want to get back to Suzanne and just offer you an opportunity to talk about some of the challenges and solutions from your perspective in relation to these issues.
Yeah, I would echo what Mohammed and Pradip have said as well. I would say, especially what you've just said around the length of time it takes building up the expertise, finding the capacity in the company, especially for smaller companies. It could put them at a disadvantage, right? Who just don't have those types of resources to access. So it's there's going to be growing pains for sure. I think, Mohammed, when you're talking about landing on some common disclosures and standards, and we're almost there, but there is going to be some time for that and to really implement that. I guess the other point is there are some conversations, but just being able to rely on the information, the assurance checks around these disclosures, right? It's making sure that that is happening, because we want, right now with that not being in place, it's the question that we're always asking ourselves, is this greenwashing? Can we rely on the information that's being presented in these various and voluminous reports? And so we're really looking forward to, once these do become enshrined in standards and our requirements, and then the assurance and reliability around them as well will come. So it's, I think those are the challenges that we're going to be seeing in the coming years.
That's the assurance is a great point. I mean, we've got about a minute left. I usually like to try and wrap things up on a fairly practical note. I mean, we have 3 interesting companies here. You're all doing interesting things. We've talked about materiality. We talked about double materiality. We talked about scope 3. I mean, what are the things that you're looking, the developments that you're watching, the things that you're looking forward to, and we can just maybe do a quick round of each person. We'll start with you, Mohammed.
I think when you mentioned in terms of what I'm looking for, I am looking at that materiality and double materiality first, because I do want the reporting that we do to be useful, because anything that gets used actually improves. Any data that you are not using becomes a checkbox. And I'll say it in if you've asked anybody in your department to say, hey, I need you to go get the statistics of X, let's say it's health and safety incidents. It's a chore if they're not using it to improve themselves. If it's something they're using to measure, then it's not a chore. So materiality is number 1. Scope 3 is the other one that Prab mentioned, and I'm glad that she did. I had forgotten about it. I'd love the scope 3 to figure out the double and triple counting that happens within scope 3. And I think that's going to happen over time. That's where I'm probably heading towards. As people start getting reporting in this, get used to it, there's an automatic movement towards some normalization.
Prab, do you want to pick up on that?
Yeah, for sure. So for me, it's standardization of reporting. We've mentioned the alphabet soup many times on this call, and I think I am looking forward to having some more standards and rigors coming from the CSSB for reporting. And I don't think any finance person would say that they're looking forward to an audit, but as a sustainability person, I am looking forward to the audit process, because I think, again, it'll add some more rigor to the sustainability reporting process. And like Suzanne said, it'll add that kind of external validation layer to sustainability reporting.
Fantastic. And Suzanne, we'll give the final word to you.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I echo what Mohammed and Prab said. Looking forward to the standardization, some clarity on that. It must be user-friendly. It must have an impact so that we're able to affect change. I think that's what I'm most looking forward to, as well as really landing on meaningful Indigenous disclosures and more Indigenous participation, as Mohammed had talked about earlier, and especially having more disclosure and transparency around free, prior, and informed consent as it relates to Indigenous rights.
That's a great way to wrap things up. I really enjoyed the discussion. I'd like to thank Suzanne, Mohammed, and Prab. That is all the time we have. I hope this offered some practical and pragmatic advice for companies that are going through these issues. That was a real aim, and I think we delivered. So we'll leave it there, and I will now hand things over to my colleague Jeff Jones. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Ryan. And boy, what a great panel that was. Hello again, everyone. For those of you who are just joining in, I'm Jeff Jones, ESG and Sustainable Finance Reporter with the Globe and Mail. So to conclude our program today, I'm pleased to be interviewing a well-known and influential leader and expert on the transition to a low-carbon economy, Dr. Bruce Laurie, president of the Ivy Foundation. The foundation provides funding to net zero-focused organizations, among others. Bruce also liaises with government, industry, environmental NGOs, and business to ensure that Canada achieves net zero by 2050 while remaining economically competitive. So welcome, Bruce. So first, let's talk about you, or more accurately, your organization, the Ivy Foundation. The foundation made waves a year and a half ago when it announced it would wind down and expedite its dispersal of $100 million in endowments. What did this say about the task at hand, and how is it going now? And also, how is the backdrop of sustainable finance playing into this?
Yeah, thanks very much, Jeff. Well, yeah, certainly for us at the Ivy Foundation, it was a big decision to decide to spend out our entire $100 million endowment over a pretty short period, 5 years. But of course, there's a whole bunch of reasons. One of them included the fact that climate change is urgent in terms of an issue. It was, climate change and transition, as you described, sort of transition to a low carbon economy is really what we've been focusing on for the last 10 years. And it struck us that we needed to accelerate our ability to get on a pathway to, a low carbon economy. And that basically means everything from, accelerating the adoption of heat pumps in homes and accelerating electric vehicles, et cetera. And we can talk about those things. So we've been supporting a lot of work really to help businesses and government think through how we get to the transition. And our thought was simply that we needed to put more money into that kind of work up front. And so that's what we're doing. And sustainable finance, at the end of the day, all of this needs to be financed. I'm increasingly wondering whether we should be calling it sustainable finance, or if that's just kind of marginalizing the finance sector. Really, it's financing the future of a competitive economy, and I think most people recognize that future will need to be sustainable.
Yeah, let's get into that a little bit. I mean, it's a competitive atmosphere in the world, especially when it comes to attracting capital. A lot of that capital is focused on environmental issues, solving climate problems. It's interesting, when we spoke before, you said, well, okay, climate change is an issue, but let's focus on the economy and how all of those pieces have to fit together. Maybe you can expand on that a little bit.
Yeah, certainly, Jeff. I mean, I'm at this point, having worked on these issues for about 30 years. In fact, just hearing your last panel, I actually did my master's degree on sustainable mining in northern Canada, Indigenous and environmental effects. So I thought, oh well, it was nice to kind of nice to hear where it's evolved, but it's been slow. And these big transitions are slow, and I think we need to. So my reference to thinking about the economy was, if you look at why people buy houses, you don't buy a house to save climate, and you don't buy a car typically to save the climate. And most of these investments in big businesses aren't really, at the end of the day, about saving the climate. We're basically making smart investments to have a more competitive, sustainable, equitable future. And, which is where the ESG piece fits in. But I think often there's too much emphasis on we're doing this to save the climate. And that, automatically starts to make people think, well, if I'm not really that excited about saving the climate, maybe we don't need to make these investments. And so I think it becomes a distraction, and certainly we've seen it's become a significant political distraction in this country by, I think, overemphasizing the fact that we're making these huge investments really about climate change. I mean, certainly that's one of the fundamental reasons we're doing it, but there's a whole lot of other benefits to having a modern, high-functioning, productive economy.
Well, Canada has been in a position before where it made a decision to become a superpower in one industrial sector, and that, of course, is oil and gas. And very successful at it, starting probably around the 1990s. Can it make that shift to say, okay, we'd still like to be a global superpower, a reliable supplier to the United States, to Europe, to the rest of the world, but do it using the technology that we're developing for a clean economy?
Yeah, and that's, I think that's really the crux of the conversation that's happening, not only in Canada, but around the world. But of course, Canada, relative to countries like the US, even though the US is the largest oil producer in the world, Canada's oil production is a disproportionately larger, or proportionally larger part of our economy. So, it's critical that we get that right. And if you look at what's going on around the rest of the world, so the U.S. is increasing their oil production, Norway is increasing theirs. You've got oil and gas leases, being issued at a pace that we haven't seen in decades. So what we're seeing is kind of I think a big scramble around the world for anyone that has oil reserves to make sure that they're the kind of the last supplier. And I understand that dynamic, but at the same time, what we need to be doing is focusing on the other part of the economy, which is creating the accelerating the adoption of technologies that are going to be replacing oil and gas. So things I mentioned, heat pumps, electric vehicles, using hydrogen and steel, et cetera. And so I think, and this is where, to me, the sustainable finance conversation really needs to focus, is how do we make sure that there is enough capital going into, build and accelerate the infrastructure, the equipment, supporting building retrofits at the pace that we need. And to be honest, the clean energy transition part, I mean, that's the second piece, but I think the primary, for me anyway, the most important one is focusing on the demand side.
And so how do we do that?
Well, we're seeing, I think, programs coming out that different governments have. We've got, I would say, if you look at the electric vehicle sector, I mean, everyone's saying there's a bit of a dip right now, but that's for a whole bunch of reasons. But I mean, without question, electric vehicles will be replacing internal combustion vehicles in the not too distant future. So that's well on its way. I think a lot of people don't realize that in many parts of the Western world now, heat pumps have exceeded sales of natural gas furnaces in Canada, in the US, in Europe, and the UK. So I think we're starting to see that well on its way. We've got some challenges, I think, in big industry, still cement and steel, but some very promising technologies, and I think those technologies need to be invested in. And we're seeing the investment tax credit programs. Your colleague Adam, was writing about the electric vehicle and battery critical mineral sort of sector today. I think we're going to see a big announcement probably next week on more investment there. So that's, and we've got billions invested in Quebec and Ontario. So, we're seeing a lot of action. I would say the one area that is still where we're still kind of stuck is the oil industry, and really kind of a very disappointing track record of investing in carbon capture. So there's a lot of talk about carbon capture, but very little investment by the oil industry in that technology.
Well, what do you think is going to break that logjam? Obviously, the industry itself, the Pathways Alliance group of the largest oil sands producers, have a plan. They have talked about the amount of carbon they want to reduce by 2030. They have a net zero plan in place. What they don't seem to have is agreement with the government on how much public money is going to fund that. So what is going to break that logjam, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question, and it's hard to it's really hard to imagine right now what will change. I would say if I were in the government, I'd be wondering why I would be subsidizing an industry that's making record profits, that has a plan and just simply isn't using their own money to invest in that plan. I don't see why Canadian taxpayers should be subsidizing multi-billion-dollar oil industry profits. So I frankly think they're going to have to put real money on the table, and that this is the oil industry, and I think they're going to actually have to have plans that show we're going to get from here to there and how we're going to do it, as opposed to advertising. So there's I just put the responsibility on the oil industry to make serious investments and have a serious plan.
Well, you heard it here, folks. It brings me to another point, and I think we spoke a little bit about this, is that there seems to be a divergence on this issue when it comes to the federal and provincial government levels, and the business community itself. They don't seem to be at lockstep. What's a way to regain some of the momentum we had when it came to political will and sustainable finance?
Yeah, and that, it really, the Fed-Prov thing is a challenge in this country, and as someone was just reminding me the other day, I mean, we can't even figure out how to have one securities exchange in this country. How do we expect to, sort out any of these other kind of complex issues? So, my view is, which I know isn't widely held with some of my colleagues, is I think the oil industry needs to be treated very differently than the rest of the economy. And it's a different industry. They have very different challenges. It's economically and politically very significant. And I think we run the risk of kind of lumping them into this is how we're going to solve climate change, rather than saying most of the economy seems to be well on its way. Most of the industries that I talk to, in cement and steel and forests, seem to have plans and seem to know where they're going. And frankly, most of them, see themselves with a long future. And the difference is that if you look at the plans of, any big plan that gets us to net zero, there's a lot less oil in 2050 than there is today. So it's an existential fight for the oil industry to try to extend their lifespan as long as possible. And that's a very different conversation than trying to convert, a coke steel mill to a hydrogen steel mill. And I think we just need to treat the oil industry very, very differently.
Well, we had quite a bit of discussion today about the development of a taxonomy, both green and transitionary in this country. There has been, quite a bit of pushback, especially from Western provinces, on any notion that new natural gas exploration, any notion that shouldn't be in part and parcel of a transition category is holding things up. How do we get past that? I mean, we know that oil and gas is important to the economy. So should it or should it not be should it not get the good housekeeping seal of approval of a taxonomy?
Yeah, I mean, and that is kind of the a big sticking point, of course. I also like to think the oil industry and the gas industry are different industries, and I think we lump oil and gas in together almost always. And again, I think this maybe be somewhat more controversial, but I would say the oil industry needs to figure out how to get carbon capture going, and I think they should take responsibility for that and make it happen. Gas is, I think, a much more complicated conversation, and I don't think most people realize that we're still in much of the world, we're replacing coal plants with gas. We're not replacing coal plants with solar and wind. I mean, there's a whole bunch of solar and wind. I mean, maybe half of it'll be solar and wind, but gas has a pretty long future, I think, in the world, and I think it is part of the transition. Whereas I really don't think oil is. So I put oil more in the category of coal, and I think we need to certainly accommodate a role for natural gas, and I don't, and I think we as well. I think what gets missing in these conversations, and again, listening to the earlier panel, it made me think, well, there's a real role for setting regulatory standards for things, and we can have financing, but there's a lot of studies out there that show what really drives finance is having a very clear regulatory framework, a clear, certain framework. And the way you do that isn't through guidelines and voluntary programs and disclosure. You do that by regulating emissions. So I think the focus in the oil industry really needs to be regulated emissions and investment in carbon capture. And then gas, we need more emission controls on methane, and finance will start to fill in once that regulatory framework is established.
Well, I mean, one of the arguments that the supporters of LNG and gas exports make is that Canadian gas could easily help reduce carbon emissions by replacing coal in other jurisdictions. But how does Canada then keep working to lower its own greenhouse gas inventory? Should carbon capture, for instance, be a necessity when it comes to new production of natural gas?
Yeah, just to kind of reinforce my last point. I'm less a fan of figuring out exactly what technology you should use, and more of a fan of just saying, if you really want to reduce emissions, you reduce them through a regulation, and industry can figure it out. If they can, through some, global mechanism that people, trust and believe, can convincingly suggest that they're offsetting coal use somewhere else. Maybe there's a mechanism for that. I think a lot of people don't have faith in the ability to actually determine whether Canadian gas is legitimately offsetting foreign coal. But at the end of the day, we need to deal with our own emissions, and there's only one sector in Canada that's got massively increasing greenhouse gas emissions, and that's the oil sector. And so that needs to be put under control. And we had some pretty decent methane regulations over the years, but we need to ramp those up, because that's the experts I talk to say that that's the lowest hanging fruit in Canada, is really capturing methane emissions. And if we don't do that, then the gas industry won't have any credibility with the other plans that they have.
Well, the federal government is already voting with our dollars on carbon capture for the gas industry, having one investment it made through the Canada Growth Fund in a carbon capture project in Alberta run by Advantage Oil and Gas. So that could be the way that they're looking to help smooth that transition.
Yeah. I mean, certainly, if you talk to anyone, I mean, especially in the finance sector, they're always looking for federal money to de-risk private capital, so I think we're going to see more of that. But I think you ask the average person on the street, should a company making tens of billions of dollars in profit pay for their environmental solutions, or should taxpayers?
So let's address another issue that we've talked about in this event over the last few hours, and that has to do with the public itself, and that is the some of the pushback against climate change measures, ESG. What will it take to bring the public back on side if indeed climate change has gone down the priority list, and what's the danger if we don't?
Yeah, it's and this isn't something that's unique to Canada. Of course, we've got inflation globally. There's housing crises across the world, as there are in Canada. So these are very, very real issues that we can't dismiss. And I've been doing this, as I said, for 30 years. So there's always cycles of environmental support, and then drops in support when economic issues become tighter. And we're seeing that right now. And then, of course, any transition. I work with an organization called the Transition Accelerator as well. And one of the lines we use is transitions are messy. There's bumps in the road, and so these aren't linear things. And I think we have to kind of ride out these periods where they are legitimately tougher. I think we have to, as we're seeing from government and the budget and the focus on affordability and affordable housing. I think that was a very smart focus for the government. I think that's the kind of thing that you need to do to make it easier for people. And I think, to me, for a lot of this, I mean, we're now in our various initiatives that we're involved in. We're probably working, directly with 300 or 400 businesses across the country, and I can tell you that whether it's people who want to install heat pumps or people who want to build more efficient homes, there are all kinds of businesses that recognize that this is going to be good for them, good for business, and they're going to be able to hire people, skilled people in good jobs. And they're the ones that I think are going to maintain the momentum. I think the political stuff will, ebb and flow, but I think it's going to be small businesses and some of the bigger, the mining companies that are out there that are really going to drive this change and maintain the momentum. I think it's important for people to realize that those are the people that are making the change on the ground, and governments don't do it.
Yeah, that's what my next question is going to be. Exactly, how do you marshal business to become leaders on this stage?
Yeah, and it's been, to be honest, it's been sort of frustrating watching what I would see as sort of a lack of business leadership in Canada over the last number of years, but that's really turned around, I think, in the last few years, and part of it is because this isn't, again, this is happening all over the world. We sometimes hear a story in Canada that we're being forced to put in heat pumps or forced to not have gas stoves. Well, that's what's going on all over the world, and we don't tend to be the country that produces most of this equipment. So basically, we'll be installing what the rest of the world's installing. And I think I was just at a session called the Building Decarbonization Alliance yesterday, and several hundred people, HVAC installers and equipment manufacturers, and I can tell you they're really excited about the opportunities for making homes healthier and cost effective, and the business opportunities for them to install this equipment. So I think that the trick is to, as I was saying, is to not make this a political issue and not make this an issue about, solving climate change. This is really, building a modern, efficient economy and helping support people in businesses to get that done. And so, but just very specifically, what we're doing at the Ivy Foundation is supporting many of these alliances of organizations, whether it's working with the electricity industry, working with the electric vehicle industry, the hydrogen industry, to basically help them with what they need, whether that's skills development, policy, access to research. That's the kind of stuff that anyway that we're trying to support.
Well, Bruce, we're going to have to leave it there. Thanks so much for your candor and the insight into all of these terrific issues. You promised that you'd have a lot to say, and you lived up to your word, so thank you very much. I'd also like to thank our other speakers and all of you in the audience for listening in. We'll be sending a link to the full event to everyone who registered over the next couple of weeks. So thank you and enjoy the rest of your day.